Hi everyone, today I'm going to be making a video a little different from my usual content. This video is going to be about bans, but really focused on ban terminology. I'm going to present a couple concepts that will probably be passively familiar to most of you, but maybe you've never crystallized into words. And the intent of this is to help people standardize their language when talking about these sorts of things. I feel like a lot of human conversation is just people talking past each other, which is rarely ever useful. And so if we can all kind of know what these things all are, it helps a lot when we're talking about these things, which is coming up often these days. So as I alluded to, here are the goals of this video. I'm going to be introducing some definitions that can be applied to basically any discussion around banning a certain card or a certain deck. I think that if we have clearly defined concepts, it helps us provide a good framework to talk about something that can get very emotional in a calm way. Or at the very least, we can look at some more measurable qualities as opposed to personal preference. I feel that if we can, have words that we agree on, it helps us from talking past each other usually. And then lastly, this is not going to be, my personal opinions about what I want banned and unbanned. It's really more my attempt to talk about terminology. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So the question that every B&R discussion starts off with is, should blank be banned? Or I guess sometimes unbanned. It could be a card, a deck, whatever. Everyone will have their own yes or no opinion, and it will be backed up by some reason. Even WotC does this. They will have a justification in their articles that they put out whenever they ban a card, which is usually nice to see kind of where they're coming from. Obviously, though, the yes/no answer to, should X be banned isn't really interesting. It's really the why that's more important here, and sometimes emotional. And this is, what the conversations are centered around is the why. So if you ask people why X should be banned, you'll often get a huge number of different verbal responses. You can say things like, oh, it's too good, oh, it's unfun, oh, it's unhealthy, oh, it has a high win rate, oh, it's dumb, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And even though all these words that are being said are different, I would argue that about 99% of the time, people are talking about one or two aspects of a card/deck. So they're either saying some variant of this is very degenerate, or they're saying some variant of this is very oppressive. Sometimes something could be both. But the point is they're talking about these two things, even if they're saying a lot of, saying these things in a lot of different ways. Oftentimes, these can get conflated or confused with one another. So that's kind of the point of this video, is to define them and help to separate them in people's minds. So first, a quick aside, the real reason that I wanted to make this video is kind of as a long-form response to a discussion, a pretty good discussion that took place on Twitter today. It got me thinking about this topic, and obviously this is too much to put into a reply or a long series of tweets, so I decided to make a video. So anyway, Bob asked if Arkham's Astrolabe should be banned in Legacy, and this was a poll he sent out. And I responded that I think if Astrolabe goes, there needs to be something else to combat the degenerate mana denial strategies. Wasteland Port Loam isn't fun or interesting. The last part, of course, is a personal opinion, or I guess the whole tweet is personal opinion. And like I said, I feel like a lot of the discussion I had in response to this was positive and good, but there were also a few times where there was some confusion around my use of degenerate. People maybe thought I was saying that either it was like a busted strategy or that it was just like a generic insult to use. And to be honest, I completely understand the confusion. I feel this word has often been overused by people whenever they don't like something or just want to insult it, even if it's not an accurate descriptor. So again, let's figure out, what degenerate means. So degenerate has a few meanings, but this one is the most relevant to us. Adjective lacking some property or distinctiveness of structure previously or usually present. So something has a quality, but it loses it, so it degenerates into a worse version of itself. And so how does this apply to magic? Well, in magic, something is degenerate if it's trying to remove a core part of the game. So when I say that Wasteland Port Loam is degenerate, it's shorthand for the spells that players choose to put into their decks and the order they choose to cast them is an integral part of Magic the Gathering. The goal of mana denial is to remove this aspect of Magic from the game. If you cannot cast your spells because you don't have mana, what you have chosen to put in your deck becomes irrelevant. Now, obviously this is very long-winded, but if I condense this to mana denial is degenerate and people don't know what I mean by that, it's also not a very good way to describe things. Now, as with most things in the world, degeneracy is not black or white. You don't look at something and say it either is or isn't degenerate. There are different levels of degeneracy. Depending, a lot of this depends on how focused or consistent the goal of the strategy is. So some examples I have here of high degeneracy are mana denial, like I mentioned, but another good example of this are decks trying to do degenerate things on turn one, like these turn one combo decks like Goblin Charbelcher or Neobrand in Modern. So why do I say these are degenerate? And the reason is, for these decks, the goal of every game is to reduce the game down to the cards in each player's opening hands and whether or not they are free or cost 1 mana. So they're taking the game and reducing it to something smaller, so they're degenerate. Examples of low/non-degenerate cards would be a card like Thalia. Thalia has a taxing effect, but it's almost never the case that Thalia is completely preventing the opponent from playing the game. It's not removing a strategic element of the game. It's just slowing down the opponent. Similar to Force of Will. Force of Will is a very good answer to a single spell, a very generic answer to any spell, but it isn't trying to counter all spells or prevent the opponent from casting any spells. It's just good against one spell. And then maybe a bit more contentious here to be included in this, not degenerate or low degenerate column is Veil of Summer. But while Veil is a very, very good answer to interaction, it's only countering a specific piece of interaction. It's not trying to counter all interaction. And this comes with a caveat, because in combo decks, this dynamic changes. Because oftentimes the combo deck is trying to lead on Veil of Summer to stop all interaction the turn they're going to win the game. So if you wanted to say that Veil is more degenerate in combo decks than it is in fair decks, that would be an accurate statement. An important thing here is that describing something as degenerate doesn't mean you think it's unbeatable. And this is a very important distinction. I'm not saying, Goblin Charbelcher needs to be banned. But oftentimes, things that are degenerate do have strategies that are good against them. What is more so is, degenerate is more so speaking to kind of how fun it is to play against. And I hesitate to use fun because that is also subjective. So maybe a similar but more objective way to put this is that the more degenerate a deck is, the less it feels like playing a normal game of Magic. This is more measurable/agreeable among the community than something nebulous like fun. And yet it's something that I think translates to fun for a lot of people, because usually when you sit down to play Magic, you want to play Magic. You want to cast your spells and formulate a game plan. But like I said, for any specific degenerate strategy that you could point to, there will probably be people who like playing against that strategy, especially if they play a strategy that beats it. Because you know what? At the end of the day, people like winning and they dislike losing, and this affects our opinions on certain cards and decks, even when we try to be unbiased. If you are sitting here and thinking, wow, playing against Garuda Cannon in Legacy is so boring and straightforward, which is true sometimes. If you have a 90% win rate against the Garuda decks, you're probably going to be placated enough to at least not be complaining about it or not calling for a ban, even if you don't think it's that fun to play against. So, this is why people can have different opinions on different decks. But anyway, again, to summarize, if two people are talking and one says, I hate playing against Charbelcher, or I hate playing against Mono Red Zirda, it isn't fun, and the other person says, oh, those decks are fine, just play a Force of Will deck, they're kind of talking past each other here, because the first person is talking about degeneracy, while the second person is talking about oppressiveness. This, I think, is a concept people are a lot more familiar with, whether they call it overpowered, overcentralizing, hurting diversity, just too damn good, etc. There's many names for it. But all these names are talking about a strategy that is very good and either can't be beaten or can only be beaten by a small set of strategies, so much so that it oppresses or overcentralizes the meta into a very small set of playable strategies. This one is a lot easier to look at and analyze because we have data we can look at to see how often a deck is winning on Magic Online. And Wizards has even more data. They can see the win rate of these decks in leagues. And you can usually just look at the win rate to see how oppressive something is, with one big exception. Sometimes there are decks that act as gatekeeper decks. Even though they don't end up being the best deck, they still strongly limit what other decks can be played. I think that the Zirda Bomberman deck is a good example of this right now in Legacy. This deck really punishes anything that isn't a Force of Will or highly interactive deck. And even if they don't end up having a high win rate against the small meta they generate, they can still be seen to be responsible for pushing the meta into a lot smaller direction and pushing other decks out of the format. And this is definitely an instance of being oppressive, even if the final win rate is, something around 50% against, the few strategies that are still around, and like Delver and, Miracles and stuff like that. So we have two concepts, oppressive and degenerate, that we can talk about separately because they are very well defined. And indeed, they are separate and don't have to relate to each other, as I will hope to help visualize in this next slide. So here I made a quick little graph with a few archetypes kind of graphed along this, 2D graph where one axis is measuring degeneracy and one axis is measuring oppressiveness. So some decks are low degeneracy and low oppressiveness, something like elves. This is usually something that is either too weak to compete in the format, or if it is strong enough to compete, it's kind of a home run in terms of format health. It plays fun, interactive games of Magic while not being too overpowered. Then there are strategies that are degenerate but have their weaknesses so that they are never going to dominate a format. I would say decks like Belcher and Lands fall into this category. They are absolutely degenerate because they are trying to remove a fundamental aspect of Magic from the game, but they also have their weaknesses, and so if they get popular, there is counterplay. On the other end of the spectrum, we have decks that are very strong but not degenerate. This is where I would categorize a deck like Delver when Deathrite Shaman was legal. It was definitely the best deck, and there were not many strategies that could compete with it, but it was almost always trying to play an interactive game of Magic where it countered some spells, killed some creatures, and then killed you with theirs. Lastly, in the last category, I have a recent example in the form of Breach, which is both, highly oppressive because it was so strong, and then also degenerate in the sense that, you would play a silence and then try to win the same turn while your opponent could no longer interact with you. But I think an even better historical example would be a deck like Flash Hulk, which was both incredibly strong and wanted to reduce Magic to what you had on the first turn of the game. So, final thoughts. Even if we have these well-defined concepts that people understand and agree on what the words mean, we will still disagree with how oppressive or degenerate a deck is. That being said, this is a little bit more mappable than just saying something is unfun or broken to a degree. Degenerate is definitely more open for debate than a deck's win rate is, but I still feel that it's more doable to decide what qualities most games of Magic have, and then see if a card or deck is trying to eliminate them, than it is to talk about something like fun or unfun. Also, people will value things differently. You could talk to someone and they could say, I totally agree with you that Grixis Delver made the metagame small, but it didn't matter to me because the games in that metagame were very interactive and enjoyable. A lot of where this value is placed hinges on how we interact with the game. So say, for example, you're a college student who only has Death and Taxes built. Whether or not a strategy oppresses Death and Taxes, or if a deck is degenerate in a way that Death and Taxes isn't equipped to deal with, that is going to matter to you a lot more than it will to a player who owns more decks and can switch decks. Same thing with playstyle. If you only like a certain strategy, how it specifically lines up versus other things will be more meaningful to you. I think time investment is another big factor here. If you only play Magic once a week or once every 2 weeks at your local game store, you might be less concerned about losing to a neo-brand player than, say, someone who grinds MTGO with the goal of winning a PTQ might be, because it's a feel-bad experience that you don't encounter often enough for it to weigh on you. Also, if we go back to the graph, notice the examples of how the high oppressive decks were banned, but the high degenerate weren't necessarily banned. It was only if it was degenerate and oppressive that it was banned. I think that we can reason that this is because WotC wants Magic to appeal to the most amount of players, And if there is a large swath of them that feel they can't play their deck in a format, it drives them away. As individuals, we can disagree with this, and we can say I love the metagames, with decks, with like the Deathrite Delver deck or with the Breach deck. But it's useful to understand that this is the bias that WotC has, and it can help us kind of anticipate what we expect the format to turn into or what they expect to do. Lastly, given that Hasbro's incentives are to make money and sell packs, and the strategy of shoot first, ask questions later that they seem to be employing is frequently at odds with building a healthy format, these conversations aren't going to go away. But language is a tool, and I think that if we have a better tool we can use to discuss this sort of thing, combined with trying to see where other people are coming from, their time investment, their play styles, etc., it can help us to have a good conversation around this topic. So, in conclusion, we defined two different topics, degeneracy and oppressiveness, showed that they do not have to be related to each other, and gave some examples of decks that exhibit high and low qualities of both. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I really hope you enjoyed this, even if it's different from my normal content. As always, feel free to leave a comment and try to keep things civil. Next time a ban discussion comes up, I hope you guys can use the tools that we have talked about here to have a nicer and more productive conversation. That's all for now. Bye, guys.